Well, last week we didn't have a class because you were running a
I
marathon.
did not. I did not. You could say I ran a marathon, but I got to the end.
Yes, you
I
did.
made it. I would not call it necessarily running, but there you go. I ran some of it. Anyway, well, thank you for giving me that leeway, and I'm happy to see you guys tonight. I want to focus on the first and most important in a lot of ways peace agreement that Israel has with Egypt, and all of the politics around it and what it means for the Arab-Israeli conflict generally, and especially including for the Israel-Palestinian conflict. So let me share my screen, and I have a little PowerPoint, which starts, it's entitled the Camp David Accords, which of course we will share with you. But I want to sort of take us back a little bit to where we ended up last week as a sort of a setup to what happens right. So peace is not accomplished easily. Let's start with that supposition. And it's sort of when I take sort of the airplane view of this 36,000 foot view of this whole process, historical hindsight 2020 and all that. One of the things that emerges is that there's a lot of war that produces this peace agreement that is lasting, and it's a cold peace. It's not a warm peace. Nevertheless, a real peace. Egypt and the United States and Israel have not had any kind of fighting since 1979 and the conclusion of that peace agreement. So the question is, how did we get there, and what lessons can we draw from it? And by the way, some of what happens in that set of negotiations that produces this peace agreement lays the groundwork for what I want to talk about beginning next week, which is for a couple of weeks, which are the very, very important Oslo Accords, which still provide the fundamental framework for how people who think in terms of a two-state solution think about a potential ending of the conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinians. Obviously, given the fact that there are missiles falling on Israel right now, or yesterday, my two daughters there, I'm very sensitive to that reality. We can sense that we're pretty far away from that. But hopefully some of this history will be encouraging to you. So let's start with 1973, right? And a couple of things that I didn't really talk about in depth at my last talk as we completed that review of this, but I just want to remind us that. So Anwar Sadat, president of Egypt, excuse me, after the death of Nasser, is still, right, Nasser was still thinking, how do we get our territories back from the 1967 war? They had adopted a Khartoum resolution. All of the Arab countries had, the Arab League, no recognition of Israel, no negotiation, no peace. And part of that was just a setback, right? Nakba, and we're going to come back and get our land. And when Sadat assumes power in the deep shadow of Nasser, right? Because I think, if anything should be clear by now, it is the gigantic political persona of Nasser in the Arab world generally, but certainly in Egypt, that Sadat really, in order to secure his, in part, domestically to secure his reputation, needed to actually go and get those territories. And the 73 surprise war with Syria on Israel, the attack on Syria. It wasn't so much a surprise war as a surprise attack, because Israel was expecting war, but in some ways unprepared in terms of the number of troops in this Sinai Peninsula that the Israel had, the kind of protection that they had up in the Golan Heights. Israel wasn't fully prepared to be attacked. And nearly in the first several days, there was tremendous anxiety among the Israeli military and political leadership that this war was not going well. But in the end, Israel was able to push the Arab forces back beyond the borders of 67, and to actually, in the north, expand their territory north of the Golan Heights into this little gray area, this darker area up here, and a little bit more on the other side of the Suez Canal. Now, this is just occupied territory, right? So 73 kind of scared Israel, as we talked about, and the military establishment and the prime minister were so upset about this that there was a call to investigate inside of Israel. What was the cause of this? How could we be caught unaware? How could we be unprepared for this? How could we get to a point where we were fearing for our very survival? In the end, it worked out, but the concern was, how do we avoid that from ever happening again? And that was a sort of a wrenching internal problem for Israel, and in part began the slide of, for sure, not in part, began the declining power of the Labor Party. Now, the Labor Party, if you recall, started under the Mapai Party that Ben-Gurion created to pull together in the British Mandate all of the differing factions under a single political leadership to help Israel, then at that time not yet a nation, assert its independence and prepare itself to fight the inevitable war of 1948. And from that point, Ben-Gurion, every single prime minister through Golda Meir were labor prime ministers. All of the governments that led the Israel were the Labor Party. And just to sort of set the stage, that right, the Likud party had been around in different formats, right? Menachem Begin was part of the Stern Gang, was part of the opposition to a more compromising approach to the British during the British Empire. So went back, there was always an opposition. There was always a harder line opposition. There was always a view of a minority of leaders in Israel about how this should be handled, but the labor government had dominated. And so when the 73 war demonstrated that the military establishment, which had been so connected and so integrated into the labor's power over the country, had essentially failed, even though in the end Israel won the war decisively. There was a deep concern about the next direction. And it didn't help much as in the years leading to the 73 war and after, that the Palestinians had a set of militants that had first started leading attacks out from Jordan, had joined and now were in Lebanon, and were continuing to view themselves as a vanguard in that violence and an unwillingness to accept any power, any land sovereignty of the Jews in this area, continued. That the Palestinian Liberation Organization, in their very dramatic attacks on civilians, hijackings, the Munich massacre, really just convinced Israelis that a compromising approach to Arabs was not necessarily in their interest, was even an impossible approach. So, after the war, and I mentioned this, and I went through this, right? There were these negotiations between Kissinger to sort of resolve, what are we going to make of this in the aftermath of the 73 war, where the demilitarized zone is going to be, where were the lines of demarcation going to be. So all of these things had to be negotiated. And the United States took the lead here. And Kissinger, as Secretary of State and National Security Advisor, both at the same time. And remember, it's 1973. Maybe you don't remember. I was watching the White House Plumbers last night on HBO, and I'm thinking about the Watergate. President Nixon is deeply embroiled in Watergate, so much so that basically he was absent. He was really absent for most of his presidency in terms of international affairs. Nixon really wanted to be involved. That was where he preferred to be involved. And I have done a lot of work on the Nixon administration. But by 73, by the time the war broke out, Kissinger was basically running everything in foreign policy. And it was like he was president of the United States, really. I mean, and there's this fascinating history about Kissinger in this period that shows that really Nixon couldn't be bothered. I mean, he would rubber stamp what Kissinger said. So all of this stuff that we're looking at here really was Kissinger. When you think about Secretary of State Clinton under President Obama, or any of Trump's Secretary of State, or a lot of what we think about in terms of international agreements were really driven by presidents, and their Secretary of State was there to work out a lot of the details, but presidents were the ultimate. In this case, it wasn't that. It was Kissinger deciding that the best way to deal with these things was shuttle diplomacy, to go one at a time, nation by nation, to set things up back and forth to Syria into Israel, to Egypt into Israel. And so these set of agreements were arrived upon. Here's Kissinger with Sadat doing that. I'm mindful of what Michael was talking to us about last couple of weeks ago. And it turns out that actually Kissinger was in Jerusalem quite a few times, met with Golda Meir. And here's Moshe Dayan here during the end of the 73 war.
Not after, he never showed up his face in Israel ever again.
Here's 1974.
I'm talking about after 1973, after the war, he never showed up his face in Israel, and they would not welcome him at all.
I'm showing you, here's 1974, not 73. Okay, he's with Golda Meir in Israel. But it's fine, Michael, I just go with it, okay? We can talk about the details in a little while, but this is important because Kissinger was in Israel quite a bit into the Ford administration. And here are some of our military leaders, Perez, Rabin, and of course, Ariel Sharon as a young general, who are all going to play prime minister roles, and more importantly, definitive roles in the shaping of Israel's history, all involved in this post period. And here he is again with Rabin, Meir, and Rabin's wife. I just thought these pictures were fabulous, and I had to share them with you. I came across them looking through some of this material again. So couple things before I get to the Palestinians that I wanted to just highlight. Well, let me say this. On the West Bank, the Israeli efforts after the 73 war were focused on trying to demobilize the Palestinian Liberation Organization. And in Gaza, fascinatingly enough, I think this is really fascinating, Israel's focus was to try to use Islamists as a counterweight to the Palestinian Liberation Organization, which was a secular nationalist terrorist force. Now, the PLO, for their part, was very focused on trying to, now that they were in Lebanon, strengthen their hold in southern Lebanon, and which would put them in the direct path of the 1982 Lebanon War, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But from the early 70s, or I should say from the mid 70s to the early 80s, there is a lot of disagreement in the Arab world. But from the early 1980s until the first Palestinian Intifada in 1987, the Arab leadership started to find ways to compromise. And a lot of them who had been absolutely opposed to Sadat's peace initiative in 79, later came closer and closer back to Egypt. So I'm getting way ahead of myself, but I did want to talk about this. So one of the other things that it's worth mentioning is that in the world more generally, there is this, there are a couple of really key developments. First of all, the détente that we spoke about in the late 60s, early 70s, a period of diminishing levels of tension between the United States and the Soviet Union during that period of time, started to fall apart. In 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. And then shortly thereafter, Ronald Reagan was elected president of the United States, and he called the Soviets the evil empire. So now we're starting to get heightened levels of tension. Saudi Arabia, who is the US's ally, the Reagan administration started to work with Saudi Arabia to try to contain the Soviets in Afghanistan. And he did that by trying to arm their Muslim opponents, the various Islamic mujahideen groups, which essentially launches, I don't want to confuse you. It's a lot of complicated stuff that I'm talking about, but think about this. There's a arms race that is ignited by the heightened levels of tension between the top players, US and Soviet Union, and it filters down into the Middle East. And it includes everything from tactical all the way up to the nuclear issue. In particular, in the Middle East, there's one other very, very powerful change. In February of 1979, there is the Iran Revolution, right? Where the Shah's dynasty is replaced by an Islamic State. And this is the first time that Islam is a major factor in regional politics of the Middle East. Iran is huge. It's a powerful country. It's almost not in the Middle East. It's all the way at the eastern edge of the Middle East. And yet, and it's Persian, it's Shia, it's much less Arabic than it is Islamic. And yet the Iranian Revolution resonates among the Middle East publics. And it's declared support in particular for Palestinian rights. in the land, quote unquote, occupied in the 1948 war becomes a very important issue. And when the US faces a major hostage crisis, 52 American officials and members of the US Embassy were held hostage for over a year, 444 days in Tehran. This was a signal to the Arab world that Iran, if anybody, could stand up to the United States. Ayatollah Khomeini put the icing on the cake and signed this very clearly for the Arab world when he took the Israeli embassy in Tehran and he made it the Palestinian Liberation Organization's embassy. Now, if that wasn't enough, there was a eruption of a major war between Iraq and Iran. And ballistic missiles were used, chemical weapons were used, both ways. Hundreds of thousands of people are dying. And in the middle of that, Israel sends, I'm going to fast forward a little bit, we'll come back. Sends a long distance mission to destroy the Iraq's nuclear research reactor in a city of Tuwita, the Osirak nuclear reactor. Israel, I mean, this is a long way from Israel. The fact that they were able to do that and take out this nuclear reactor sends a message to these warring parties, Iraq and Iran, that their chemical weapons and their missiles and their effort to acquire a nuclear weapon, Israel is not going to stand by easily there, right? So they're learning some lessons from 73 to be much more aggressive about signaling and about actual strategic actions to Arab countries that Israel is going to defend itself. So let me come back a little bit here. All right, so, sorry. So you got the return of the Cold War, and you've got the end of the 73 war, the signing of these demarcation agreements. You got the invasion of Afghanistan, the Iranian Revolution, Saddam Hussein's rise to power, and then we'll talk in a little bit about the 82 Israeli invasion of Lebanon in the middle of their civil war. So there was some discussion of what should happen in Europe between the United States and the Soviets with Israel and the Palestinians in 74. All these countries are signing on, and in 77 in particular, and they're basically discussing diplomatic measures, environmental concerns, lots of other things. But in 77 specifically, America and Soviet Union, who are enemies, agree that there should be a comprehensive peace between Israel and the Arabs, including the Palestinians. And this calls for a peace conference in 77, that the Geneva Peace Conference, that lays the groundwork for the Egyptian Israel peace deal. It starts that. And it also lays the groundwork for a 1986 accord between Soviets and the United States about peace in the Middle East. But between this period of time, the 74 and 86, you got the second Cold War going, which really heightened tensions. I'm not going to show you this video, but you might want to watch it at some point, just to remember, if you can remember back in 79, what it was like to watch this happening on television. And then here is Israel, surprise attack on Iraq, taking out their nuclear reactor. Now, in this period of time, there's this, Palestinians are in the southern part of Lebanon. So just I should take you back to that map just to remind you what it looks like. Sorry. So here's Lebanon up here. And so the Palestinians are in this area, and they're able to launch attacks. Right before, they were in Jordan on the West Bank, and they were able to launch attacks in the West Bank, off the West Bank, excuse me, into when it was Jordanian, and then after 67 from Jordan, and then Jordan pushes them out into Lebanon. Now they're launching attacks from Lebanon. This becomes particularly perilous for Palestinians who've already been recognized by all of the Arab League, excuse me, as the sole representative of Palestinian people. Yasser Arafat has been in front of the UN General Assembly and has a chart. The PLO has a charter that says that they doesn't recognize Israel, and that they are committed to an armed struggle, and they want a secular democratic society, meaning Palestinian, instead of the Jewish state, right? They're basically calling for the destruction of Israel. And this is, heightened level of concern, heightening concern within Israel about the PLO as they start to engage in these terrorist attacks. Now, right after the war, the 67 war, the General alone creates about 20 different settlements, labor government, in the Jordan Valley and eastern slopes of the West Bank. And they avoid construction areas where there are a majority of Palestinians. Alone proposes that the West Bank and those areas that are mostly Palestinian, that those should be given back to Jordan, but that there had to be, for security's sake, a corridor between Jerusalem and the Dead Sea and west of Ramallah. But then there's this alternative approach, Gush Emunim, which proposes this idea, this movement, that we should have a full greater Israel from sea to sea. So let me just show you a little picture of the Alone plan. This is the idea that now this never becomes official Israeli policy, but it does become the guiding approach to how we're going to settle these settlements. Okay, so all of these green areas, the idea is, let's return these to Jordan, because these are areas that are mostly Arab. And all of these blue areas should be annexed to Israel, for lots of reasons, not the least of which is historic attachment to it, but also for security purposes. And there should be a link between these two areas with free access for the Arabs. So this is where we're standing at this point now. But the Palestinians are not making it easy because of things like this. And I'll just show you a little brief reminder of this.
A masked gunman steps onto the balcony of 31 Connolly Street in Munich's Olympic Village. He knows the world is watching. Hundreds of TV cameras in place to cover the Olympic Games, now trained on this window. Inside, 2 Israeli athletes are dead. Another 9 Israelis held hostage by a group of Palestinian gunmen calling themselves Black September. A hastily established crisis team is trying to negotiate their release. The terrorists want hundreds of Palestinian prisoners released from Israeli jails. Nothing else will do.
Isa, the chief, told me more times, even when I asked again, don't try. I'm a soldier. I got an order. I have to fulfill that order. You offer us a window, and this window we have to use to show the situation of our people.
Security at the Games was minimal. For reasons still unclear, officials also appeared to have ignored one of 26 possible terror scenarios, which specifically warned of a possible hostage-taking by Palestinian militants. The lax security approach was deliberate. Authorities wanted to show a very different Olympics and a very different Germany from that of 1936, when Hitler had hosted the Games in Berlin. But this fear of appearing in any way militaristic had given rise to a police force that was completely ill-equipped and untrained to deal with terrorism. The plan to pledge the terrorists safe exit, then kill them, went disastrously wrong. In a firefight at a nearby military airfield, the terrorists turned their guns on their hostages. Once the firing stopped, all 9 of the Israeli hostages, a German policeman, and 5 of the 8 terrorists were dead. Fencing coach Andrei Spitzer was killed that night. His wife Anki remembers visiting the flat in Connolly Street.
I went up and by myself, and then I stood there in the room, and the chaos was incredible because, blood all over the place. They brought them food that they didn't eat. They didn't let them go to the bathroom. It was total chaos. And I just stood there and looked, and I said to myself, if this is where they spend the last hours of their life, I am going to talk about it. I have to tell about it.
Olympic dreams shattered in a very black September, when the face of international terrorism, now all too familiar, made its horrifying grand entrance onto the world's television screens. Diana Magne, CNN, Berlin.
So in a way, you can see why it's not surprising that
a lot of people don't know
that there's a movement of Gush Emunim, the Bloc of the Faithful, a religious ideological group that says, no, we don't want to limit how we control areas that we've captured in a war, that from the Israeli perspective, we won in defense, right? And then we were almost decimated again. We don't want to back off. We want to expand, right? So the goal was to settle every area that was exempted from the Alon plan. That's what Gush Emunim said. All of the populated areas of the West Bank mountain ridge. The first one was in 1975, a settlement, Kadimim, which is just to the north of Nablus, which is one of the Palestinians' largest cities. And then Ofra, which is right near Ramallah, which is also a huge Palestinian city. And other religiously oriented settlements expanded. Kiryat Arba next to Hebron in West Bank. This is all in 75. Then there are new Jewish neighborhoods that are established in East Jerusalem, on French Hill, Ramot, Neve Yaakov, Gilo, all of these neighborhoods. And then beyond that, there are settlements that are reestablished in the Sinai and in the Golan Heights. Okay, so from the Israeli perspective, just to get back to 73, right? They were fighting a war for their survival. And now the idea that that there was any anything else that they can do but to defend themselves and to strengthen themselves militarily was a false sense of security that they had engaged in prior to 73 as a result of the 67 war. And so they're very self-critical of this. Now, all of this feeds into what becomes the Israel's invasion of Lebanon in 1982. Now, I've talked about this before, but Lebanon's a complicated place, right? You've got a Catholic, French connected government, basically, heir to French colonial heritage, Catholic control, surrounded by a majority of Muslims and some other nationalist leftist groups that are not Islamic based, some newer ones, right? The national movement was formed in 1969. So you've got an older history and you've got a colonial history, religious conflict, and you've got political anti-colonial movements. So this is not a religious conflict. There are alliances between the national movement and PLO elements, but particularly through not the PLO so much, but the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine and the Popular Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, led by two other guys, George Khabash and Hawatma, who were competitors to Yasser Arafat. All of that's occurring, and there's heightened levels of tensions, and there's a growing civil war by 75. Meanwhile, Palestinians are in refugee camps in southern Lebanon, and from those refugee camps, militants are launching attacks on Israel. So the Maronite militias, the government, decides to stop this because they don't want Israel launching attacks into their country to counter this. And they want to confront the Palestinian liberation groups directly and militarily. And so you can see how this is starting to heat up and become chaotic. The PLO that rejects a more conciliatory or more pragmatic approach that Yasser Arafat is seen to embrace when he's presenting to the United Nations. I didn't mention that the 10-point program that Arafat presents says that we'll accept land that is short of all of the land, as if that, right? So from their perspective, they're compromising, because up to that point, the Palestinians, or PLO and Fatah, were only saying, we'll either take all of it or none of it. And now they're saying, we'll take what we can get. But the rejectionist front say that's capitulation to the Zionists, and Libya and Iraq are joining with that national front in Lebanon. And Arafat is trying to stay out of this whole thing. Arafat and the PLO is trying to stay out of this. He's focused on getting Palestine liberated for the Palestinian people. He doesn't want to be involved in a proxy war in Lebanon. The civil war in Lebanon pulls in Syria to support the PLO rejectionist front, fighting against the Maronite Catholics, right? And the Saudis are supporting the Maronites. And so now you've got a war between Saudi-backed Catholic Christian militia and Syria-backed Muslim and nationalist militias. The Syrians have got most of their power in central Lebanon, and the Palestinians are further down in the south. And this leads to an Israeli invasion in 1978, which supports the Maronites. And that's and in 78, Israel pushes into the south of Lebanon. And the goal here is simply to get the PLO out, or at least further up north. And Israel is also supporting the Maronite Lebanese leader, Saad Haddad. And they draw a red line in the south of Lebanon. And they say, as long as you guys stay up above that, we'll leave you alone. That's assumed to be basically the Litani River. And that's in 1978. At that moment, you start this period where you got Carter, Begin, Sadat engaging in peace discussions. Let me sort of set this up a little bit before I get into the details of what happens here. And then we'll come back to Lebanon. So in a way, there's two extremes here, right? You've got the most dramatic breakthrough in terms of Arab willingness to make peace with Israel. And at the same time, you've got heightened levels of hostility to the Jewish state from the Arab world. Let's start with Sadat's visit in 1977. This is the first visit of any Arab leader to the state of Israel since its independence, right? Ever. And here is Sadat at the Knesset in November of 1977. And you can see here Menachem Begin on the left and Yitzhak Shamir on the right. And I picked this picture in particular because to draw a connection between this period of time and the rise of the Likud, right? Both of these men, Menachem Begin becomes the first Likud prime minister, and Shamir will be a prime minister later, a Likud prime minister later in Israel's history. But the decline in the power of labor has yet to be felt, right? So 77, you've got Menachem Begin winning the very first Likud victory, majority government, and they're starting to sense that so the question is this a momentary blip in loss of power for labor, or is this a sign of labor's demise, right? And now, from the perspective of 2023, we can say it's labor's demise. But, and part of it's surprising history, is that Sadat comes to Israel to make peace with the more hard right prime minister, Menachem Begin. And Sadat's trip to Israel, though, is preceded by the 1974 disengagement agreements that were signed by both countries, negotiated by Kissinger, and another disengagement agreement signed in 1975, allowing for further Israeli withdrawals. And then the Geneva Conference, where President Carter in 1977 pulls together a conference. And this leads to growing tensions because Carter's a Democrat and the Likud government is reluctant to engage in peace agreements about Palestine and Palestinians. And then in July of 1977, Menachem Begin comes to Washington, D.C., meets with President Carter, and they agree that they will reconvene a Geneva conference on the Arab-Israeli conflict in the fall of 1977. And Begin goes before the Knesset and he confirms that he's going to do this. He's going to go ahead. He's going to show up. In that summer, in August, Cyrus Vance, who's the Secretary of State for the United States at that time, works with Sadat directly. And Sadat and Vance together try to negotiate, and they involve other foreign policy ministers from Middle Eastern countries The one person who's not showing up to this meeting with Cyrus Vance in August of 1977 is Syrian President Assad. Assad says, before I sit down and talk, I want to know exactly what I'm talking about. I want advanced substantive issues for discussion, and I'm not going to go to this. I'm out of this. Israel, for its part, says, we'll participate, but we don't want any representatives from the PLO terrorists. The PLO, from their perspective, are terrorists, and we're not going to accept them there. And so in November, Sadat stuns the entire Egyptian parliament. First, he goes to his own parliament. He says, quote, I'm going to go to the end of the universe to end the conflict and save the sons of Egypt, unquote. And that meant he was prepared to go to Jerusalem and address the Israeli Knesset. Begin hears this, calls him up, invites him to come to Israel, and 2 days later, Sadat's in Jerusalem. Now, before he gets there, Sadat calls up Hafez Assad, president of Syria, and he says, why don't you come with me? And he can't convince Assad to do that. Now, I want to just point, everything I've talked about is high level, except for Cyrus Vance, perhaps, and the foreign ministers. But one other thing that should be noted is that there were secret talks going on all the month of October between Egypt and Israel under the king of Morocco, who was bringing together, and that include Moshe Dayan and Hassan al-Tuhami, who's the foreign minister, special emissary from Egypt. So they're talking, they're trying to hammer out something. It's not really clear what exactly Moshe Dayan gets to an agreement to in the month prior to Sadat coming to Israel, but it seems like it was pretty darn significant that, Michael mentioned last week, a couple of weeks ago, that Dayan himself took the early failures of the Israeli military in 1973 war, that he was personally responsible as the chief general of the IDF. I can imagine, I don't know if this is the case, but that he went into this as a way to sort of make up, right? That he would get a peace with Egypt. If he couldn't win the war easily, they did win the war, but that he would make sure that this never happened again. And part of it was to negotiate a peace deal, and he set it up. So when Sadat shows up in Israel, like the wheel has been greased, so to speak, right? There's a lot of effort that's behind it. And that's the picture I want to say. So Sadat goes to the Al-Aqsa Mosque first, and then he goes to Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Museum, the Holocaust Memorial. And then he goes to the Israeli parliament and he addresses them. And he says, look, we need a comprehensive peace agreement. We need you guys out and back to where you were in 67. And he says, quote unquote, there can be no peace without the Palestinians. So this is historic, but it doesn't just immediately translate into immediate changes on the ground. Meanwhile, you can imagine, right? And here is Menachem Begin when Anwar Sadat says, we want you back to 67. Menachem Begin says, that wasn't defensible, right? That set us up. We're too vulnerable. Peace cannot be established should Israel restore or agree to restore the fragile, breakable, aggression-provoking, bloodshed-causing lines preceding the 5th of June, 1967. We can't go back to where we were. So there's this opportunity for peace, and that's when President Carter says, look, Prime Minister Begin, President Sadat, come to Camp David in the United States. So what do you think the responses of the other countries, the other Arab countries, with Sadat doing this? Take a guess.
They're not happy about it.
Yeah. Any further things? Yeah, they're not happy that Egypt is now striking out and going to have a peace. First of all, that Sadat went to the Knesset, recognizing, right? Why? Why would they be so upset about this? Just to follow up.
Sylvia has a comment.
Okay, go ahead, Sylvia.
Okay. I was waiting to hear yours, Rosalie. Well, I'm thinking that they're thinking that Sadat is going to go behind their backs, and he's going to grab everything that he can, and doesn't care about the rest of the Arab world. It is not insignificant that not too long after all of this, he gets assassinated.
Mm.
Yes. No, it's for sure part of that. Yes. Please, Michael.
Okay, first of all, the reason is he broke the line against Israel, no negotiation, no
Exactly.
recognition, no nothing. But the question is, why did he do it?
Right.
So I'll tell you the story. I'll tell you the story. You did not come up so far. Okay, Begin, the Shin Bet found out that Sadat was going to be assassinated. There was a plot against him. And Shin Bet told Begin about it. And Begin asked, what do we normally do with such information? And he says, usually we give it to the United States and they pass it on to the Egyptians. And Begin says, no, do it directly. And when Sadat found out that the Jews were correct and they were not plotting, it was not Israel plotting against him, he could trust the Jews. That was the turn of the events. That's what happened.
Well, that story is totally interesting to me, and I believe it. But I think there was also a sense, like the official story, the official narrative to Michael's excellent question, which is why now, was that Sadat said, okay, we had war. We had 67. We had 73. Right? We had war. We had these war of attrition before 73. We've had a lot of people die.
Yes,
Egyptians.
but the point is both sides was mistrusting each other. That is the point I'm trying to tell you. That the trust was established by Israel telling Sadat, you are going to be dead very soon, and we are the one on your side. That's what changed the story. And about the pictures that you gave before, in 1974, Kissinger was in his capacity as from the State Department, and because of that, they had to smile to him and accept him. They could not send away an official from the government, but I'm going to send a few of the placards. I went to the internet, I did some Googling, and I got some pictures of Kissinger from the 1974. It was still at the time he was in office, and negotiation for the first and second engagement were going on. But you know what Clinton did the last thing after he left, the first thing he did after he left office? He went to Israel because they loved him. Kissinger never went there because he's considered a traitor.
I see. Okay. No, so now I understand your point. Yes. So, well, that's interesting. And I will say one of the things I wanted to say about the 73 war, which I haven't said yet, which is that there are a number of individual figures that are critical here, right? Golda Meir, fascinating figure. Her dedication and her commitment and her internal certainty that Israel was absolutely right, and her lack, I mean, I don't want to say that she didn't care about the Arabs, but her first and foremost focus was on the survival of the Zionist dream, and her concern was always for the Zionists, and so she was very strong and very reluctant to consider potential engagement with Palestinians or with Jordanians or with Egyptians. She was convinced that Israel was standing alone against the Arab world and didn't even trust the United States. And in fact, for a lot of the war, she was kind of freaking out because America was unwilling to convincingly provide more U.S. armaments, even when Israel was starting to lose the war, until the very last moment. And Golda Meir was convinced that, you know, America is not going to come through for us either. We've got to figure something else out. And so that's one figure I wanted to sort of focus on her. There is, of course, Yasser Arafat's towering role in the Palestinian world. And then there's Sadat's, which I think Michael's story really brings home sort of how personal this was, that Sadat, even though he personally might have felt like he was going to be assassinated, and maybe that was the decisive factor, I can't get inside his brain. I do know that the documentation says that at this point, he was convinced that war was not going to get the Sinai back. They could not get the Sinai back, and he needed to show something to get out from under the shadow of Nasser, but also to sort of do something for his country. I mean, he was actually a patriot for Egypt in a lot of ways, and one of their, I would argue, probably the greatest leader. But that's my personal approach to it. But his view was, it hasn't worked yet, and maybe with the heightened levels of Soviet U.S. conflict in the world, Egypt, by coming towards the United States, by trying to reach out to its ally Israel, could try to secure some protection and some support, financial and otherwise, from the United States. But the third personality, I think, which is particularly interesting, is this Kissinger person. So obviously, the first Jewish Secretary of State in the history of the United States, one of the very few who simultaneously served both as National Security Advisor and Secretary of State, and the only one who served for that long in both positions, and over 2 presidential administrations. Ford kept him on in both positions. Kissinger had an unprecedented, as I was painting this picture earlier, unprecedented amount of authority because of Watergate, plus the weakness of the actual Secretary of State prior to him. I'll come to you in one second, Michael. Kissinger's approach as a political scientist was to think in terms of broad, grand strategy, Cold War politics, US versus the Soviets. Everything was seen through that prism. And he was very reluctant to tip his hand one way or the other in the Middle East, because he was trying to seek out a kind of balance of the United States on both sides of the divide between the Arabs and Israel, in preserving an advantage for the United States in the Cold War, right? If the United States was going to sort of give up all Arab ties and let the Soviets move in, that was not something he wanted to do. So a lot of people, and everywhere, in Egypt, in Israel, Michael's absolutely right, perceived him as two-faced, as a liar, as somebody who wasn't trustworthy, because he was going here and saying what they wanted to hear, and then he was going there and he's saying what they wanted to hear. The shuttle diplomacy could be seen as brilliant and as effective, and it also could be seen as duplicitous, and that he was not committed to anybody in particular. And so ultimately, Golda Meir really felt that way until, especially in 1973, when U.S. Arms didn't come until the very last minute, and provided Israel with the wherewithal to encircle the the Egyptian army in the south of the Sinai and ultimately win the 73 war there. But it took a while. It took a while. So go ahead, Michael. I'm sorry.
I just wanted you to read those captions that I took from the pictures. The first one says, in Egypt, it is Kissinger. In Israel, Killinger. Okay, second one. Hail Kissinger, the savior of the third Egyptian army. Third one. Dr. K, we shall not win you another peace prize with our blood. Another one. The biggest liars and traitor of the century, Muhammad Yovanovitch Kissinger. Another one. We have learned the lesson. Dr. Kissinger, stay at home.
Okay, so listen, I don't want to just like we could bash Kissinger all day. We could talk about it.
No, the point is, the point is
there was lack of trust, right?
No, not lack of trust. He withheld weapons from Israel, and he forced Israel to let the third army, the Egyptian army, go. He prevented Israel from having a decisive win in that war. That is the Israeli complaint.
Yes, absolutely. So, okay. So, but I wanted to point out, right, when we do the analysis from sort of the broad Cold War analysis to the interest, the various narratives of the different units, the states, Egypt, Syria, Israel, personalities were really important in 73 and afterwards. So, okay. This Sadat breakthrough then depended on a lot of other things, right? So if you sort of see all of this, and then Carter's early foray here, right? He's inviting Begin and Sadat to Camp David, and I think we have that picture next. Yeah, here it is. And so, if for those of you who don't know, Camp David is the White House has a getaway. Not too far away from the White House in Virginia. And here they are together, right? And this was this historic thing. Now, at the summit, Israel authorizes its delegation to present a plan for the West Bank and Gaza as a basis for ending that conflict. Because that was the one thing that was keeping Sadat from getting to a negotiating table. That until, right, in order partly to save face with the other Arab countries, as you guys point out correctly, right, I should have mentioned, right, he is, basically kicked out of the Arab League, Syria, Iraq, Libya, Algeria, South Yemen suspend all relationships with Egypt, and Begin goes to Egypt, but although their military security committees are coming to some agreements about how to negotiate, long-term security between the two countries, the biggest gap still remaining is this issue of the Palestinians. Egypt says we can't do anything until we have something on the Palestinians. And that's where Carter says, okay, we're too close. He gets them together and he says, look, here's what we're going to do. Right. And this is a successful summit because they kind of commit to really basic principles for an Egypt-Israeli peace treaty. Now they're talking for a real peace treaty. And that includes, of course, Israel returning the Sinai to Egypt. And the second piece was a 5-year plan. And I want you to think about this term, 5 years, because that is similar terminology we'll see with Oslo, but a 5-year plan for an autonomy regime. That's the language they use at this time in the West Bank and Gaza. Right, that's as best they get. Those are the two commitments they get. So they come out of this and they start to negotiate the details. right? This was the top level people. They get to commitment to principles. And right here it is. I have it right here in the slide, sorry. Okay, so that's in September of 78. And then in October, they're negotiating, not those guys, the staff are talking at the Blair House in across from the White House. And they're still having problems over this linkage of Palestinians and the peace treaty between the Egyptians and Israel. So Carter takes a page out of Kissinger's book and he decides he's going to go to Israel. He first goes to Egypt, then he goes to Israel, and he smooths out the differences. And they have a text. And on March 19th of 1979, Israeli government the Knesset approves the text of the peace treaty. I'm sorry, the 22nd, they approve of the peace treaty and a vote of 95 to 18. So pretty lopsided vote in favor of it. The Egyptian parliament unanimously approves it. On March 26th, they sign it at the White House. So this is Egypt's withdrawal, first stage, second stage. Now, in 1982, Israel starts, let me go back one more, right? There were some settlements in this area. So by 1982, 79 to 82, Israel promises.
Can I interrupt? In the picture, there was something in Hebrew that I want you to note. It says, there was a sign on the building. It says, the good ones to the roof.
Oh, I'm gonna come to the next slide.
Oh, the picture that you just showed.
Yeah, I'm gonna go back to that picture.
Okay,
Yeah,
but the point is that I don't want to say it again. There is a little sign there, okay, and a poster says the good ones to the, you see that in the center at the bottom, left to that guy, it says, Tovim lagag, meaning the good ones to the roof, because it's in Hebrew, it's an expression. It's like if you the good guys go to be a pilot, okay? So the good people should go to the roof so they will not be evacuated.
So they won't have to be evacuated, right? Yeah. So I mean, this is they evacuate 18 settlements with about 7,000 people are evacuated by the Israeli government in 1982. So Gaza is not the first time Israel engages in this, pushing their settlers out of settlements. And this is very, very, you can see it's violent, right? There's Yamit is the largest of them, and it has about 3,000 people there. And there's a lot of resistance from the settlers, but it's formally and totally evacuated. Now, the Arab reaction, right? Here's Israel doing this, and the Arab reaction is horrible, right? They can't stand, right? Like Sylvia pointed out, Egypt, you went by yourself and did this? You're cutting a deal, right? So Egypt is boycotted. It's sanctioned. It's expelled from the Arab League. The Arab League's headquarters had been in Cairo. That's when they moved to Tunis, right? So Egypt's membership in the Organization of Islamic States is suspended. And they're even threatened to be removed from the non-aligned movement. In Egypt, despite the fact that the parliament gives unanimous approval to Sadat, their foreign minister resigns, two of their foreign ministers resign, and the outside of the governing circles, it's even stronger. The Muslim Brotherhood is up in arms. They can't stand this. And violent radical Islamists are gunning for it. And in 1981, as Sylvia points out, Sadat loses his life. He's assassinated. Now his successor is this guy, Hosni Mubarak. Mubarak served for 31 years. The next time we see a change in Egyptian leadership is in 2011 with the Arab Spring. Right? These are the massive protests against Mubarak's dictatorship in Egypt in 2011. He eventually steps down after 18 days of demonstrations. He's replaced by Mohamed Morsi, a general who was in charge. And eventually, here's Mubarak, who's and his sons, who are eventually convicted and sentenced to for killing peaceful demonstrators. Mubarak, in the earlier part of this history, right? So I will say Mubarak's replaced by Morsi, who's replaced by El-Sisi, who's still in power. So we've got basically long-term leadership of dictators in Egypt since Sadat. Now, Mubarak, I'll come to the Saudis in a minute, was committed, like Sadat, to carrying on the peace plan with Israel, which is remarkable considering that we had military governments and soft coup and military coup and long-term dictatorship. And even after, one of the things that was one of the biggest fears that Israel had was during this time was that should Mubarak be deposed, what will happen to the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty? Will the new leadership installed by the people after 31 years of a dictator still want to uphold the Israeli peace treaty? Because it's no secret that the Egyptian people don't love Israel. In fact, quite the opposite, and very sympathetic to the Palestinian cause. And so the question is, will this uphold? And surprisingly so, it has. And yeah, go ahead, Michael.
Yes. First of all, did I hear you say that Morsi was a general?
Yeah.
No, it was not. It was just a cleric, a Muslim cleric. Okay. There was a democratic election, and he originally Islamic Brotherhood, and they said they will not even participate. And at the last minute, they did change their mind and participated, and he was elected to be the leader of the country. Now, what happened was that you mentioned about Israeli fearing what would happen next is very interesting. The Islamists that surrounding the Islamists that were surrounding Morsi. At one point, they had a conference and they left the microphone open. And they were talking about attacking Sudan and attacking Israel. And that's where El-Sisi took it over.
Yes, I'm sorry. I reversed it. You're correct. Absolutely 100% correct. Morsi was overthrown by a military coup.
Yeah, but he was not. He was just a cleric. That's important. Yeah. And he was elected
so he had a legitimate
democratic election.
Yeah, no, that is very important, right? And so, but my point in terms of going back and going forward this far is to say that what happens back here, going back, was profound, right? This really sets in motion a chain of events that is really important for Israel's conflict with, in this case, Egypt. So. Even before Sadat's assassination, however, there are a number of Arab world leaders who are starting to think maybe this is a good idea that Egypt did this. Morocco, Oman, Sudan, all started to think, well, maybe a military solution to the Arab-Israeli conflict is an impossible solution. And that a political settlement is inevitable. And in fact, here's what the Saudis come up with. Saudi Crown Prince Aziz comes up with an 8-point peace plan known as the FAD plan. And it's worth noting again that the Saudis have come up with these kinds of peace plans since this time, a number of times in 2002 and 2011. And in fact, in 2017, Crown Prince Salman, right, the one who's essentially responsible for the murder of Khashoggi, the Washington Post journalist, that they came up with their own peace plan, right? In fact, in 2017, there's this story I want to tell you about a mysterious trip where Mahmoud Abbas, the Palestinian president, went to Saudi Arabia's capital to talk to Prince Salman, and they wanted to discuss how to respond to President Trump's peace proposal for the Middle East peace. And according to people who overheard their closed door discussion, the Crown Prince said that basically, here's a plan that basically says, you guys, Palestinians, should accept what you got and don't expect to get any of the settlement land that the Israelis have. You're not even going to get East Jerusalem, says Crown Prince Salman in his proposal. Abbas was shocked that this is what the Saudis proposed. And then when this became reported, they denied it and they said it's fake news and all this stuff. So, but well before 2017 and 2002, there was the Arab Peace Initiative proposed by the Saudis, which was a very short proposal that basically said, the entire Arab League endorsed it in 2002. According to the API, the Arab Peace Initiative, there were 57 different Arab countries that signed on to this that said they will establish full diplomatic and normal relations with Israel in exchange for a comprehensive peace agreement with the Palestinians. Believe it or not, Iran signed that. This is in 2017. I'm sorry, 2002. So Jerusalem rejected that, and the one question is why the Gulf states were so interested in this, and this is very important because it gets to how the Abraham Accords got established, right? Prime Minister at the time in 2002 was Ehud Olmert, who welcomed the Saudis' initiative, and in a little known but episode of Arab-Israeli interaction, a semi-official Arab League delegation came to Jerusalem and discussed that peace proposal in 2002 with Olmert and with Tzipi Livni, who was the foreign minister for Israel at the time. In 2007, they reaffirmed this peace officer, and Israel said that they remain sincerely interested in pursuing a dialogue with Arab states that desire peace with Israel. And the Arab League was very surprised by Olmert's enthusiasm and pulled back because they didn't want to actually have to sign off on this. They didn't want to be seen as normalizing relations with Israel. So they eventually had a secret meeting of lower level diplomats from Jordan, from Egypt, from Israel foreign ministers and lower level. And they had this constructive meeting. And right after the meeting ended, war broke out between Israel and Hamas on the Gaza Strip. And then another war a couple of years later, and this is lost to the wind. So this is the first of many efforts by the Saudis to try to get and insert themselves into the process and try to establish a peace. And I want to highlight that because there's a lot of talk oftentimes that the Arabs are never interested in peace. They don't want any peace. They just want to destroy Israel. Here's repeated efforts, and maybe you don't take it seriously, maybe you do, but like clearly Ehud Olmert took it seriously. And there are, obviously difficult aspects to negotiating these things. The FOD plan basically says, go back to 67, take apart your settlements, give a Palestinian state with East Jerusalem, and guarantee the Palestinians their right of return. They don't refer to Israel by its name. And what's interesting about this is that this is essentially the outlines of the two-state solution that was looked at in Oslo, that has been continuously examined over and over and over again. So there's not a lot of daylight between all of this stuff. Now, I promised that we get back to Lebanon. So let me get back to this. So you've got this negotiation of the peace agreement that's on the cusp. We're almost there, is signing this, right? That you've signed the Egypt-Israeli peace agreement. And the question is, what else? What's going to happen next? Can this translate into a movement for peace? And then you've got the Israel invasion of Lebanon. The Lebanese civil war, subsequent Syria intervention, where Syria is basically controlling, it's chaos in Lebanon. There's an agreement between Syria and Israel that there's a red line, right? The same red line, Litani River. And that Israel's not going to get involved. But then the Palestinians, who are basically told Israel's not going to get involved, so now they're not facing any repercussions, start launching attacks again from South Lebanon, right? We know in 78 there was this invasion up to the Litani River that pushed the Palestinians. They just move up further north. In 81, there's more violence. And then in 82, there's this decision to go in and destroy the Palestinian Liberation Organization. And the war architect here is Defense Minister Ariel Sharon, and also Lieutenant General Raphael Eitan. And their idea is they're going to go in, they're going to dislodge the PLO altogether. Well, they go up. Here's the first invasion. It's just 36 hours up to the Litani River. This is in 78. And they push Fatah up north, and they create a security zone. But then when they go up again, they go all the way up as far as to Beirut. And they expel all the Syrian forces that are already in Lebanon. The PLO is defeated. The Shia in southern Lebanon are freed from Palestinian domination, and the Maronite Christians are back in control of Lebanon. Syria, however, comes back and overcomes some of those Christian Maronites and assassinates the Christian ally of Israel, Bashir Gemayel, the principal Christian ally of Israel, who's the head of the Maronite forces. And without the Christian forces are really unable to fight back and are engaged in a massacre of children and women in Palestinian refugee camps, and both in Sabra and Shatia, these Palestinian refugee camps in this area. And Ariel Sharon, who's the general at the time, decides to withhold Israeli defenses from defending the Palestinians. The outcry that comes internationally, regionally, and inside of Israel, including, forces Israel to just pull out of Beirut, pull out of Lebanon, and includes U.S. Marines. U.S. Marines come in Yes, go ahead. Right. I'm sorry, Michael, I see your hand.
Oh, okay, sorry. I just want to say there was not actual decision to go to Beirut. It's actually Begin vehemently objected to it, and it was surprised when Sharon pushed it all the way. It was he did it without permission. The second point I want to say that the president that was assassinated, right? Did you know he was assassinated when he was assassinated a day before what?
Oh, I don't know.
A day before he was going to sign peace with Israel.
I see.
There was a joke in Israel in those days. Okay, and the border with Lebanon used to be called the good border because people from Lebanon used to go to Israel, buy, shop, and get a job, go to hospital and everything. It was an open border. And so the relationship was so good that the joke in Israel was that nobody knew who was going to be the first one to make peace with Israel, but they knew who was going to be the second one. It was going to be Lebanon. But they did not expect to have him blown up. And that's what caused, from there on, the Hezbollah to take over.
Yeah, right. I mean, and but there's this other whole story. Thank you, Michael. Absolutely. Like, Begin never said you're authorized all the way to go to Beirut. The idea was just to go back up and take out PLO forces again, up to the Litani River line, right? That was it. Maybe a little bit above it, but that was all they were authorized. But Sharon was convinced that he's got to push Syria out of there too. So then, right, and here's a picture of Sharon when he was a young man at this time. Now the U.S. Marines, I'm going to come to this picture in a minute. U.S. Marines were sent in to secure the safe departure of Palestinians after this massacre of Palestinian women and children in the Shatia and Sabra refugee camps in southern Lebanon. Israel had completely lost control of the agenda in Lebanon, and now Americans had moved in and made for increased tensions between the American military and their Israeli counterparts. On the one hand, this whole operation succeeded. PLO had to leave, and they go now to Tunisia, where the new Palestinian Liberation Organization headquarters gets established, and that's where it stays until the Oslo. On the other hand, the weakening of the Palestinians and the strengthening of the Maronites results in the beginning of the Shia era, a large minority in Lebanon who seize power. So in terms of the Palestinian and Jordanian fronts, Israel tries to undermine the influence of the PLO by encouraging the emergence of anti-nationalist forces in the West Bank and in Gaza, hoping to see a very strong pro-Jordanian elite emerge in the West Bank, and this is critical, a traditional Islamist elite in Gaza. Why? Alternative to the Palestinian Liberation Organization. So under the banner of the Muslim Brotherhood, focusing on building mosques and charities and schools, other social services, they view the nationalists as the problem. The Islamists didn't pose an immediate threat to Israel in Gaza, in the West Bank, in East Jerusalem. And so Israel tolerated their activities, including their institution building, right? These Islamists are building institutions. In 1979, Sheikh Ahmed Yassin, who would later found Hamas, this is the founder of Hamas, was registered as one of the largest Islamic institutions in the territories. The Islamic compound is what he runs. And for nearly a decade, this is the headquarters of the Muslim Brotherhood, and becomes the symbol of growing Islamist power in Gaza. Now, Israel saw the goal of an Islamic state in Palestine that they read what these folks were writing and heard what they were saying, but they believed that this was far-fetched, that they'll never do this. They can talk about this, but the nationalists, the leftists, Arafat, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, they had blown up airplanes. They had killed people, right? They were the Black September, right? And so this is a better alternative, says Israel to themselves. And then they actually, in 1976, Israel organizes local elections under the defense minister of Peres, Shimon Peres, in 1976. And the idea is to give local pro-Jordanian elites a chance to win an election, and therefore to weaken the militant nationalists. And Israel says, we're going to accept, Peres says, we're going to accept Palestinian self-rule. And so Peres is kind of envisioning a kind of Jordanian option, a federation, that Palestinians will elect their local leaders in the West Bank, and that they will achieve a kind of moderate kind of leadership through this way, and that Israel and those leaders can, along with Jordan, and can maintain security in the area. Jordan would have civil administration, Israel would have military security. And it totally backfired. It totally backfired because most of the people who won the elections were nationalists. The new mayors in the West Bank were younger. They were better educated than the pro-Jordanian ones. Even in traditional communities like Hebron, nationalists were replacing strong pro-Jordanians. And this new elite had very hard-line views. They were fully identified with the Palestinian Liberation Organization. And they created a new National Guidance Committee, NGC, that spoke for the Palestinians on the West Bank. Israel wanted to ban the National Guidance Committee and deported to Jordan 10 of the elected mayors of these pro-Palestinian Liberation Organization mayors. They deported them to Jordan, which only, of course, encouraged the nationalists' support on the West Bank. And in Gaza, they basically established the origins of Hamas. Okay, so let me end with this, right? Israel Knesset in 1980 passes a basic law. Now, basic law in Israel, as you probably know, if you've been following a lot of the judicial controversy about what should happen with the weakening of the Israeli judiciary's independence, Israel doesn't have a constitution. Instead, they have these basic laws, which are seen as higher law, that have sort of a, where our courts would rule, you can't pass a law that violates the U.S. Constitution. In Israel, would say you cannot pass a law that violates a basic law. So when it passes a basic law, it's a big deal. That's like a transformative moment in terms of governance. So this is really important. It says, most importantly, that Jerusalem is the capital of Israel, right? That's a total contradiction to UN Resolution 242. A united Jerusalem is the capital of Israel. That's important. I should have said united Jerusalem. Basically, the Palestinians who are East Jerusalem are there. They're permanent residents. They're not Israeli citizens, but it provides the legal basis for the Israeli annexation of East Jerusalem. The UN responds and says this violates international law. I had mentioned earlier that the Likud came to power in 1977. And in 78, they start building more settlements. It's a secular party. It's a conservative party. It's focused on security and expansion and controlling the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And so they enter into this new phase of settlement building in the West Bank. Settlement budgets increased from $3.4 million in 1976 to $34 million in 1983. And there were only 20 settlements in 1985, and there were over 100 that were subsequently built by Likud. And these are very large settlements: Malay, Adumim, Modein Elite, Beitar Elite, and Ariel. I've been to Ariel. These are giant cities. These are cities, right? There are others that were built near Ramallah, others built near Bethlehem, big Arab populations. 4,400 settlers grew to 42,000 settlers. In Golan, there were 11 new settlements. So settlements start to become a bigger and bigger issue at this point. But the ultimate importance of this period was really the conclusion of this peace agreement, which remains in place to this very day and operative. What I want to do is next week, and I will open it up for a few questions right now, but next week I really want to talk about how this is viewed by, of course, by Israelis, Palestinians, other Arab countries. We've talked a little bit about it, but I want to get into that in a very straightforward, detailed way. And then we'll talk about the Oslo framework, the establishment of the Oslo framework in 1993. So let me open it up and see if you guys have comments or questions, as I've been talking the entire time. I don't know about you guys, but I found the establishment of the peace agreement in '79 quite moving. And when I read that history, I am persuaded that as awful as things are at any one point in time, thinking about having fought a war, Israel having fought a war with Egypt twice, and really 3 times when you consider the war of attrition, thousands of Israelis killed in those wars. That a conservative, the very first conservative prime minister, right, not Labor, came out of the, and friendly to the Gush Emunim, not really came out of, but friendly to that movement, would be willing to negotiate a peace agreement with their number one enemy. That is encouraging to me, that at any point in time with the right leaders, and we don't have them right now, I'll say that, but at any point in time, the right leaders can emerge and something grand can happen. So I remain optimistic for a 2-state solution, but we will talk more about that next week. And Michael, it seems like nobody else has anything to say, so I'm going to let you have the last word, bud.
Okay, I'd like to say, first of all, Israel had at least 4 wars with Egypt. And
Right.
if you talk about the attrition, it was going to be a 5th war. So it was
Yes.
48, 56, 67, and 73. Now, Israel, okay, I was born there, I was raised there. We are a tiny country. We know we cannot live forever like Sparta with enemies all around surrounding us. We cannot afford being in war all the time, okay, and be fearful every day, every night. So Israel always was motivated to be to make peace with the neighbors, and let alone, even though I'm not so religious, our own religious talks about peace all over the place. Okay, so that's one thing. The other thing that I want to tell you, I just did Googled and found something about Mohammad Morsi, who was asked as a president, and there was this article in The Guardian, and I'll just read the first paragraph. Egypt's first democratically elected civilian president, Mohamed Morsi, has collapsed during court session and died almost 6 years after he was forced from power in the bloody coup. Morsi, a senior figure in a now banned Muslim Brotherhood. He was the leader of the Muslim Brotherhood, which is the same thing as Gaza. The Hamas is a branch of the Muslim Brotherhood, and that's why Egypt does not have a good relationship with them either. And of course, they closed the border between Gaza and Egypt. It's not only Israel, but the Egyptians do the same.
Yes, and it's pretty fascinating when you think about that, and that Egypt has been involved in negotiating currently right now a ceasefire between Palestinian Islamic Jihad, which is a fairly new group, and Israel, although it doesn't seem to be sticking very well.
Okay, that particular organization, what is it called? The Islamic Jihad is actually supported by Iran.
Yes,
so
exactly.
the Egyptians don't want the Iranian over there either. So of course they'll want peace, and they want them out of there as well. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it is. And one other thing, as long as I'm here, I've just sent a message. You mentioned the son of the guy who created Hamas. Okay, a few years ago. Okay,
Yeah.
he was not alone. There was other leaders. One of them, okay, had a son. His name is called the Green Prince. He became an Israeli collaborator. He spied with the Shin Bet against his own father, and had his father in jail to this day. And the man is talking all over the place. I sent a link so you can watch it. Please watch this particular one. It is unbelievable. Okay.
I think I saw him. I think I heard him speak. Yeah, and I think I have his book. I've not read his book.
Watch, and there was a movie about him too, right? But watch this 5-minute segment that I just sent over. It is the most incredible statement about what's going on between the Arabs and the Israelis, coming from the son of Hamas. Okay, and by the way, he converted to Christianity, and he